I'd love to just know, as you're reading from these religious and spiritual texts, whether it's scripture like the Bible or any other source, how do you pull from that? Like, what is your kind of filtering mechanism? Could you give any examples, right? Because I think that there are people who can hold the, let's just call it kind of rationalist, mathematical faculties while simultaneously having faith-based religion or spiritual practices. They don't have to be faith-based. I mean, you could be a mystic with direct experience. It's very different, though, to integrate those things. Right? You can have those two things coexist in you, but some would view them as antithetical to one another, right? So how do you filter? And are there any examples that come to mind of things you've pulled from spiritual practices and looked to port over into the scientific?
A couple things. One, from the Upanishads, there's this saying, not that which the eye sees, but that whereby the eye can see. Know that alone to be Brahma, the eternal, and not what people here adore. Not that which the ear hears, but that whereby the ear can hear. Know that alone to be Brahma, the eternal, not that which the mind thinks, but that whereby the mind can think. Know that to be. So there's this distinction between pure awareness versus the contents of awareness.
Right.
And when I realized that they were making that distinction, I looked back at my math and I realized that when I was writing down these mathematical models of consciousness, they're probabilistic models. And you have to write down, when you do that, you have to write down a probability space. So there's just this thing. It's this timeless thing, a probability space. And then you have the dynamics occurring on that space. So the mathematics itself also models there's this pure awareness beyond time, beyond the dynamics. That's what I call the probability space. And then there is the dynamical system of the contents that appear and disappear within that system. So I realized that there is this really interesting correspondence between the kinds of things that they're saying. The contents, there's pure awareness, and in some sense they'll say what you are is not any of your contents. You're not your body. You're not the sound of your voice. You're not your possessions. None of that stuff is you. You are the pure awareness, and the pure awareness is what survives death, but not necessarily any content. Well, that does seem to correspond pretty well with some of the mathematics that I wrote down, just because I had to write it down that way. That's just what you do when you write down the mathematics. And so I find these kinds of correspondences really interesting, and I want to pursue them further. The other one that I think is really interesting is the insistence. And I get this, you get this in many of the spiritual traditions, but I see it really clearly, like when Eckhart Tolle is explaining these things in his books, like A New Earth and The Power of Now and so forth. He points out that thinking is not a very deep intelligence compared to the realm of our reality beyond thought. So in these spiritual traditions, one of the things you do in meditation is you let go of thought completely, right? Any thoughts that come up, you don't fight them, but you don't give them any space. They let them go. And the point that they make is that as you do that, and it may take you years to really be able to do that, you are getting in touch with an infinite intelligence that is much, much deeper than any thought intelligence. And in fact, is the source of all intelligence that comes through our thoughts. And so if that's right, that also makes sense from this Gödel's incompleteness theorem point of view that I've been taking on this. That is that consciousness, there's no description of it, including any conceptual thought description that we can give, that even scratches the surface of the depths that Gödel's incompleteness theorem says is there. So I see this correspondence again between letting go of thought. So there's this really interesting thing. We need thought. Without words, we wouldn't have this conversation, right?
Hard to podcast. Very difficult.
Hard to podcast with. So it's not like words are bad and concepts are bad. The question is what is the relationship between conceptual systems and this intelligence that transcends any conceptual system? That's the really interesting. Now, the spiritual traditions will say it's a pointer relationship. Where I'm using the word aware as a pointer. Of course, the word aware, don't take it too seriously. You can also call it consciousness, whatever, but don't take the pointer too seriously. And then some pointers are really bad, right? So we have this notion of good and bad pointers. Well, so as a scientist, I'm going, now that's really interesting. What do we mean mathematically by a good pointer versus a bad pointer? Can we actually take these ideas and make them more rigorous? So for example, I'll just give a really simple, concrete idea of kind of thing that I'm talking about. The real numbers, the real line, from minus infinity to infinity, right? So that's a lot of numbers. How about the integers?
I'm no mathematician, but it sounds like a lot of numbers.
It's a lot of numbers, right? And now just the integers from minus infinity to infinity. Well, right, there's between 0 and 1, there's a whole bunch of real numbers, right? So there's a sense in which the integers are a very good approximation to the real numbers, right? There's so many real numbers between 0 and 1. 0 is not really telling me anything about the integers between 0 and 1. So you could say that the integers are a pointer to the real numbers, but it's a really bad pointer. But now take the rational numbers. A rational number is an integer divided by an integer. So you just take any two integers, you get a ratio. Those are called the rational numbers. And it turns out that the rational numbers are what mathematicians call dense in the real numbers. You can approximate a real number as close as you want with rational numbers, but not with integers. Now, it turns out there's just as many rational numbers as there are integers. This sounds crazy. So the number of integers equals the number of rational numbers. The integers are a bad pointer to the real numbers, but the rational numbers are a good pointer to the real numbers.
Yeah.
They can approximate them. So this is the kind of thing that I see. Can we take the spiritual idea that what we are is an infinite intelligence that cannot be captured by any finite conceptual system, language, for example, speech, thought? We have this notion of good, bad, and worse pointers. Can we make this idea, which has been for thousands of years in the spiritual traditions, can we now dust it off and make it serviceable in a more rigorous way? Can we actually take spirituality and turn it into a scientific discipline? Again, which is not to desiccate it and deprive it of its life, but to make it precise and make it actually serviceable, actually make predictions. I would love, my father was a minister in a Protestant fundamentalist church. Here's what I would love. The guy gets up and his sermon is, guess what we just discovered mathematically about spirituality this week? You won't believe it. Here's this new theorem about spirituality. Sign me up. I would love to go to a church like that where they're telling you the new discoveries, where rigorous discoveries about good pointers to, here's how to think about consciousness. Here's a better way to do your meditation. And we now have this mathematics to explain why you should do it this way and not that way. I would just love that kind of thing. And I think that science and spirituality eventually could collaborate.
Now, question for you. Would spirituality not at that point cease to be a useful term, in so much as if spirituality is, and please feel free to disagree with the wording, but an attempt to describe with words, these sort of clumsy, imprecise labels, glimpses somehow, if we look at the mystical traditions, into this fabric beyond space-time. Like by the time they converge, we will have the tools and the mathematics to obviate the need for this word spirituality. Is that nonsense that I'm spouting?
Well, I think that's a very natural question, and my attitude is that science itself is in the same boat. Science will never have a theory of everything, And science will always, as Newton put it, Newton described it near the end of his life, he described himself as a little boy on the seashore amusing himself with a little shell or a pebble when the vast ocean of truth lay unexplored all before him. I think that's exactly right. And that's the right attitude that science should have, is that no matter how far we get with our scientific theories, we have to understand that we will always be playing with pebbles on the seashore, just like Newton was. At least Newton was smart enough to understand that he was playing with pebbles. And so the fact that the spiritual people are also just playing with pebbles on the seashore, but they're pointing to the ocean beyond and saying it's beyond conception. That's why I think the notion of the pointers is really important.
Yeah, for sure.
Good pointers versus bad pointers. We can never get a theory of that. But if the spiritual traditions are right, and if conscious realism is right, even though you can't get a theory of it, you can know it by being it. Right? So you can't know that infinite intelligence through your conceptual analysis. You can get good pointers to it, and science can help us get good pointers. But you can only deeply know it by actually letting go of thought and being it. But then, as a scientist, you can go there and be it, and then come back with the goods in your own conceptual system and make progress in your science. And that's where I see this possibly going. Scientists would actually learn, once we let go of our physicalism, would learn actually how that we as scientists are that infinite intelligence, but our conceptual tools are inadequate. So we have to go into that infinite intelligence in pure silence, and then learn how to come back and take whatever insights we have gotten into terms that we can actually write down in mathematics, and we go back and forth that way. So that's where I see science and spirituality eventually going. And so it's going to require a scientist to actually be not only a master of mathematics and the theories, but also a master of letting go of thought and actually going into the deep intelligence, if this whole approach is correct.